just going to give a a minute or so, just as names are streaming in. Brilliant. Okay. Well, it's a good time to get going. Welcome, everyone, to the launch of our report, Extremism and Terrorism Researchers, Security, Safety and Resilience. Really delighted to be chairing this panel. It's a report that the team members, including Liz, myself, Maura, and 3 or 4 other individuals, I've been working on for a really long time now. Actually, 3.5 years ago was when we won the pot of money to conduct this research. So it's brilliant to finally see it come to fruition. I am Joe Whittaker. I am a lecturer here at Swansea University in cyber threats in the Department of Criminology, Sociology and Social Policy. My role today is going to be relatively minimal. I'm going to introduce the panelists in a second, and then Liz is going to speak for about 20 minutes or so, just presenting some of the kind of main headline findings of the research. And then we've got 2 incredible discussants today who are going to both share their thoughts on the research, as well as linking it to their own experiences in their own research capacity as well. And then I guess before getting going, I think the final important thing to note is that this is really the first step of a piece of ongoing research that we're engaged in. So what we first wanted to do was gather a lot of researchers' views and experiences, get it out there. And then the second step, which we conducted in September, was a workshop in London, in which we brought together practitioners from outside the academic community, from practice and other forms of research. And in future, we're looking for many ways to kind of expand this forward, as well as thinking about trying to develop best practice guidelines, as well as thinking more specifically about ethics and ethics review boards and things like that. So I suppose what I'm saying is watch this space, because this won't be the last piece of research that we put out there. Okay, so I'll introduce the panelists now. So the first speaker will be Dr. Elizabeth Pearson, who is a lecturer in criminology at Royal Holloway, University of London. Her main research interests are kind of gender and extremism, but also looks through that within a CVE lens as well. She has a book coming out soon called Extreme Britain, Gender, Masculinity and Radicalisation. Our first discussant will be Meili Criezis, who is a PhD student at American University in Justice, Law and Criminology. And she's also a graduate assistant at PERIL, the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. And that's also at American University. She's also a fellow at the Accelerationist Research Consortium. She's done loads of really great research on ISIS activity online. But in particular, she recently wrote a really excellent GNet insight on the experiences of women of colour in the field of extremism. And then the second discussant is Jacob Davey, who's the head of research and policy far right hate movements at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. He's done, again, loads of really great work on things like anti-Semitism, conspiracy network, COVID-19, disinformation. A few reports last year, or maybe 2 years ago now, sorry, on gaming and gaming adjacent platforms, which was really getting to the crux of this kind of field of research very early on. And as someone that's currently teaching a CVE course, CVE Online specifically, Jacob's done a lot of really great work and reports, everything from kind of direct engagement pilots all the way to kind of critiques of monitoring, measurement, evaluation. So a really great panel. So with that, I will hand over to you, Liz, to get going.
Thanks very much, Joe. I'm going to share some slides. So hopefully you can now see the slides and also hear me. Is that right? Great, thanks very much. So thanks very much for the introduction and for everyone coming along today to this presentation. We're launching the report, as Joe mentioned, tomorrow, and I'm speaking on behalf of the team. Some of them I think are in the audience. It's been a great project to work on, and we've all been extremely motivated by this issue as we're all part of the online extremism and terrorism research community. So In this presentation, I'm going to talk about sort of 3 parts of the report and say a bit about how we got the data for this. And I'm going to focus on harms. They are not inevitable, but we have documented a wide range of harms in this report to researchers. We're also going to hear about how researchers cope and why they are focused on the community, their own community of researchers in terms of getting help. And we're going to look at why and how institutional responses are lacking. And really the report makes an argument that now with the expansion of this research space is a really good time to take stock for institutions to do better at safeguarding researchers and researchers to be part of that conversation about making this space better for them. Joe talked about the next 2 phases of the project. This is the culmination of phase 1. We did interviews with some 39 online extremism and terrorism researchers, and we think this is the first time really there's a comprehensive document covering the harms, the coping mechanisms, and the institutional responses. We have spoken to researchers predominantly at universities with a couple of think tanks as well, but mainly I'll be talking, this is sort of applicable to university research. We had, of those researchers, 22 men, 17 women. Mostly the participants identified as white or white Jewish, but we have 7 researchers who identified as people of colour. And the interviewees were based in the global north for a specific reason that interviewees in the global south could face very different challenges, and we want to look at those separately. But of the 9 countries we spoke to researchers in, we had people from 13 different nationalities, some with dual nationality, and some of those researchers who talked to us did also come from the global south. So to move on to the harms that we found when we talk to people, and I should mention as a kind of trigger warning that if you're working in this space, some of the things that I'm going to talk about will doubtless resonate with you, and just mention that now. The first thing is kind of good news, really, and that is that we found that harms were not inevitable, even though we did find a range of harms in this report. 30% of those researchers we spoke to didn't experience significant harm, and 12 told us that they didn't think they'd had any harms at all. So there was some discrepancy here. Senior researchers with more than 10 years in the field, half of them said they hadn't experienced significant harm. Looking at junior researchers with 5 or fewer years in the field, so often PhD researchers, as you can see, 12 of 13 said they had experienced harms that had some impact on them. So there's a clear kind of divide there. I think it's important to say that, one thing that came through was whether researchers could judge the harms to themselves adequately, whether they're best placed to know if they're being harmed. And some people said, we haven't experienced harm, but who's to say that in 10 years' time, we won't reflect back and think, actually, we didn't see the harms coming. This is still very much undocumented. And I think it's also important to say that everybody doing this work really valued the work that they did. They thought it was important. It's contributing to ending violence and division. And also many people said to us, we wouldn't be able to do this work at all if it wasn't for the internet. So it's not all bad news at all when we're talking about harms. Now, some of our researchers were focused on jihadist groups, some were focused on the far right, and some were looking at emergent groups or movements such as incels and the manosphere. And there were some differences in the types of materials that they're looking at. As you can see from the transcript here, we had people who were researching jihad and jihadist groups who were really exposed to a lot of brutal visual violence, videos and images. And that wasn't quite the same. The tone of far-right content wasn't quite the same. It was more propaganda that was harmful or abusive. So there's kind of difference there in terms of what people are looking at. But in terms of the harms, we saw harms across the board. Even when the material was different. It didn't have to be really the most brutal material in order to be harmed by the things that you were engaging with as a researcher. And we saw three types of harm, with the first two really leading to the third, which was a kind of secondary type of harm. We had internal kind of emotional, psychological harms affecting your well-being. We had external threats to one's physical security, and a secondary harm produced by those, and often linked to fear of those, were professional harms to academics, including fear around legal harms. People, because they were nervous of being victimized, of being trolled, for instance, online, were reducing their visibility, reducing their media profile, reducing their presence, and this was having impacts on their professional status and their career progression. Now, this slide is not exhaustive at all, but this gives you some kind of idea of the range of harms that we saw. We know that you don't have to be directly confronted with violence and trauma to be traumatized. Vicarious trauma has been well documented. We had participants who described, for instance, hearing things that were not there, seeing things, having flashbacks. Somebody talked about walking across a beach with their family and suddenly being reminded of that jihadist, the ISIS video, where a group of prisoners is led to their execution along a beach. People talked about withdrawal and isolation, paranoia, fear. They talked about always wanting to sit with facing the door if they were out in a cafe. They had this hypervigilance. And we use terms like this in the report, though they're not always terms that were used by the participants themselves. They hadn't necessarily got that language to describe and categorize the things that they were experiencing. We also saw, in terms of sort of physical security, that participants had been doxxed, they'd had their address put online, they'd been trolled, there'd been pylons, they'd been abused. There had been, in the worst cases, threats to acquaintances, a possible attack on a home, and probably the worst experience was somebody that eventually had to have a family member relocated. There were death threats, and 9, which is a significant number given its 39 participants, had experienced death threats, with one of those being quite credible. So the range of harms and the severity of the harms could be severe where those harms did occur. It's also important to note that your identity really mattered in how those harms were experienced and the potential amplification of those harms. Academia is expanding. I noted that, we are researching, jihadist, far-right groups predominantly, but the types of extremism we are engaged with and terrorism are ever diversifying, and one's identity is really important, really salient to how that research goes on. If you are a woman and you are researching misogynist groups, that impacts on you. If you are Muslim researching jihadist groups, you are at risk in different ways. Sexuality didn't come up, but in our participants, but they referred to colleagues to whom that was relevant. And if you're a researcher of colour and you are researching far-right racist groups, then you are again at different type of risk. We also could see that junior researchers were exposed more in terms of risks. And this was partly because they have the least status and they have the most they perceive to lose in terms of speaking out. They have precarity in the field. They want to prove that they're good researchers, and they're nervous about saying anything which might lead to them being perceived, they think, as weak or unable to cope or not having the right personality to be able to do this kind of work. Whilst most people did speak very positively about the community of researchers, clearly helping one another, there was also a minority who were nervous around this kind of bravado that can be evident in the field and can stop people from wanting to speak up. And of course, academia is a space in which there is a lot of pressure on time, and bullying is not something which is unfortunately kind of strange to this research space. So this led to professional harms. Why? Because academic researchers, unlike people in police or tech, we're named public figures. We're expected to be putting ourselves out there, volunteering to speak to the media, being on social media, writing threads when there's a terrorist attack, co-authoring work, then publicizing that work. We are accessible. We're meant to be there for students to come and see if we work in universities. We're meant to be able for public to come and see us and engage with the public. So our promotion and our career progression is reliant on visibility. So that does put us at a very specific kind of a risk that isn't necessarily exactly the same as even those who work in think tanks that we spoke to. So to move on to the coping mechanisms from harms, we did talk to people about how they coped, and because half had no really clear idea of the specific risks they were going to be facing, they might have thought, well, it might be a bit dangerous, but they didn't know in what way. People were developing coping mechanisms somewhat ad hoc as they went along, and it was trial and error, and it was often because they'd got things wrong that they managed to work out what it was that they needed to do to put those things right. And some of this was around, boundaries. Now, it isn't the case that you have to be a certain type of person to be able to cope with this. You can learn to cope. You can learn coping mechanisms from other people around you or from that trial and error. And people were learning around, technical know-how, such as using a VPN to hide their identity online, not having personal information online, using private companies or software to see what is visible about them. Instituting professional boundaries, learning that it's best not to look at jihadist videos just before you go to bed, to make sure that you're not looking at things on your personal phone, to use a burner phone, for instance. I've got a picture of a lab coat here because one of our respondents said, I actually make that boundary very clear when I go to work. I put a lab coat on when I'm doing my research. I'm not, in a lab, but when I take it off, I know that that's it. I'm not going to be looking at that type of work anymore. So they were instituting those boundaries, those distancing techniques for themselves, physically or through kinds of different things that they'd learned. Again, tips like, reducing the screen size, reducing the volume, reducing the brightness, and these are all sort of listed and documented in the report. They also coped through talking, but what really mattered here was that they could talk to the right people, and the community of researchers doing the same types of work was really, really important in that, because they were just people who got it. You didn't have to explain, you didn't have to kind of make them understand, they just knew the types of things that you were dealing with. And that was preferable for most participants to institutions, and also somewhat preferable to the wellbeing and therapy services within the institutions where they had them, because they weren't tailored. You had to start off explaining, I'm looking at this stuff and it's quite violent, and people didn't want to burden therapists with this. So it was easier for around half the participants to actually just talk, well, more than half of the participants to talk to people that were colleagues that knew this terrain. And desensitization, I mentioned there, so black humor, dark humor around doing this kind of work, although people worried that this was, maybe not a very healthy way of coping. To give you some indication, and our report uses a lot of participant transcript because it really speaks very clearly for what participants are experiencing. This is perhaps at the one end of the kind of precautions taken, this idea of having a weapon at home or a home security system. I think this gives you a sense of the degree of fear that people can feel, and the sort of more extreme ways that they've worked out in order to cope. So when things are bad, they can really be very bad. Now, I want to move in the last part of the presentation to how institutions deal with research and the harms and risks that researchers face. And it is important because researchers that we spoke to often seem to carry a lot of that personal responsibility for keeping themselves safe, when the institutions could be stepping in to do that work for them and to take that responsibility for them. And what we found is probably not going to be a surprise to anyone in this webinar, is that there was quite a patchy approach, very piecemeal approach institutionally. And this was varying across countries. Some countries were better than others, and across status within your institution. Are you employed by an institution, or you are a PhD student, and we talked, PhD students were the kind of, I guess, professionally the most junior that we spoke to. They enjoyed different levels of support. And how were you employed? Were you tenured, or are you working on a short-term contract as a sort of graduate teaching assistant, for instance? Are you in a precarious position within this space? So there was real variation across what kinds of provision people were given. And one thing that came through was that, in some institutions, in universities and think tanks as well, will have some kind of ethical approval process for research, but often within an institution setting, the online is not really seen as a field. It's not a place. It's not like going to Iraq or Syria. It's not understood as a location of research. So therefore, and because a lot of people are engaging passively with the data, they're not actually seeking out people to talk to. There's no internal review board process. There's no human research ethics committee process for respondents to go through. So this is kind of unsupervised. They're on their own. There's no institutional process to safeguard them. And for those that have got institutional safeguards in this process, they still didn't feel it was that great. They felt it's box ticking, that the committee doesn't necessarily understand terrorism. They get sort of instantly worried that terrorism is going to be something really risky, and they become very risk averse. It's also clear to us that for a lot of people, the work they were doing on online extremism is a side project. It's almost a hobby project. It's falling through the gaps because whilst their main supervised project that they put in a bid for and they got funding for has some institutional oversight, there is no oversight over this kind of hobby project which is going on in the background. For those who had absolutely no institutional support, they did say this hasn't helped us in terms of stress and harm. And for those who did have institutional support, as I noted before around therapy, it really wasn't helpful if this was generalized. They wanted things to be specific. They wanted to be able to not traumatize, not fear traumatizing or burdening someone who is just not familiar with this kind of terrain and with these levels of discussion of violence. And that's why the informal community was seen as a better sort of source of support. Relevant to this REASSURE project going forward, 10 participants wanted to have some written guidance, and 12 wanted a much more formalized support network, not this ad hoc network through conferences and social media. It is worth noting that some wanted actually, though, less institutional oversight. They felt that once institutions get their fingers in the pies of the research, they might want to stymie research because they didn't fully understand it, and they felt that it could actually put the brakes on research and be ultimately less helpful. The concerns around institutions also related to that physical space. It's all very well saying, don't take your work home with you, but if you're a researcher and you don't have a dedicated workspace, if you're a PhD student with a very generic research room in the library, then it's very difficult to be doing work that looks at, graphically violent videos when you're worried that other people might be walking past and seeing that violence. So there were concerns around not just the lack of emotional support, lack of well-being, lack of advice and support, lack of ERC support, but around this kind of just the nuts and bolts, the pragmatic space that you're doing this work in. So it's a really different picture to law enforcement. And of course, it's worth mentioning here that people perceived that institutions like universities were very much skewed towards protecting themselves in that ethical approval process. We had examples of good practice. We talk about those in the report. And this is the picture of kind of what good practice looks like. One thing that was quite interesting was this idea of mandatory wellbeing sessions that were written into project proposals and budgeted for. Doesn't matter if you don't want to talk, but you do need to turn up, and there's no stigma around then turning up when you do so. So I'm going to finish presenting now, and really just to summarize, say, with the next stages of this, what next? We do in the report argue for institutional responsibility. It should not be the burden of researchers to protect themselves, particularly when we know that marginalized researchers, women, researchers of colour are bearing more emotional risk and therefore doing more work in kind of trying to protect themselves. We do want to see formalised support networks and guidance for people so that nobody starts working in this space without having any idea of what those specific harms will be. And we hope this report will help people to know what they need to be prepared for, and also that it is possible not to experience harm at all. We do want the internet to be seen as a key research space. You know, that we've been doing this work, some people have been doing this work for decades, so it really isn't new. And we do want to evolve a language which enables researchers to discuss the harms that they face and discuss that properly. Thank you very much for coming along. I'm really looking forward to what Meili and Jacob have got to say about this, and you can get in touch with us for more information about the next stages of this project. Thanks very much. I'm going to stop sharing now. Thanks, Joe. Back to you.
Thank you very much for that, Liz. So yeah, as Liz mentioned, we'll move on to each of our discussants will make a point about both how they found this research and how it relates to their own experience. One thing I should have mentioned as well is we are hoping for 15 or so minutes, maybe a little bit longer of Q&A. So do feel free to use the Q&A function and get your question in early, and we can try and get to them. I'm sure we will get to them. And I suppose actually the other thing I should have mentioned was we are launching the report right now, and it will be published at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning on the VOX-Pol website. So expect a storm of tweets from our end. So with that, I'll pass over to Meili, and just if you're happy to get going.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again so much for the invitation to join the panel. And yes, really looking forward to the release of the report tomorrow. So yes, I'm a PhD student at American University, and I've been researching Islamic State online propaganda since 2018. And actually, when I first got into it, it was a bit more haphazard, where I had really wonderful supportive supervisors, but at the same time, it was kind of a thing where they hadn't really looked at online extremism stuff before. I had never done it. So when I got permission to go online, it was just very, okay, let's set up an account. Okay, probably shouldn't use my real number, probably shouldn't use any, real background information, use a VPN, just very basic protocol. But other than that, I really had no idea what I was getting into. So at the time, it felt very exciting and interesting, and like a really important component that complemented excellent research from academics and independent researchers and journalists. But, actually seeing what are the extremists, promoting themselves online, it felt like a really important a component that was missing. So that's why I was very much like, yeah, is it okay if I look online? They said yes. So yeah, looking back on it now, the way that it was done, not to the fault of my coworkers or anything, but just the way that it was just kind of a newer thing at the time, I do see how it was quite risky. And I'm looking back on it now, I think, oh my God, that was very haphazard. That probably was not the best manner of going about it. So when I see, panel discussions on this topic like right now, and excellent reports coming out, it's really a wonderful thing to see, because hopefully it'll help researchers who are just entering the field or are even interested in doing this stuff. Like they'll be able to try to consider what are the risks, what are the personal levels of risk that they are willing to take, and considerations for their families as well, of course, because we are never just isolated by ourselves. So hopefully it'll be a wonderful resource to help guide people in a lot more carefully, instead of just kind of throwing yourself in the deep end and going, well, we'll see what happens. So yeah, I mean, and of course I can expand on other components as well. So in terms of the categories of harm, coping mechanisms, and institutional approaches, for me personally, I have not felt too much harm. I mean, I try to use coping mechanisms like, not watching videos. Unfortunately, I do not have to really watch IS videos. It's more of looking at the written content and kind of the still visual imagery like photographs or Islamic State stickers. So I feel like that's kind of been a great thing that I've been able to avoid, like seeing them, hearing the sounds as well of from these videos. So it's been quite helpful for me. Yeah, I think maybe the only thing that resonated for me was sitting with my my back to the wall, and I am looking at the door. I've actually been like that for a long time, and it makes me extremely nervous not to be able to position myself in a restaurant. So I'll rush ahead of friends and go, oh my God, rudely kind of cut in front of them and awkwardly be like, yes, I will sit here, thank you. Did I cut in front of you? Yeah, I kind of did, but I do not want to eat with my back towards the door. So I think for me, that's maybe one of the more obvious things. And then, yeah, in terms of coping mechanisms, dark humor, definitely a big one for me, and also other friends in this space. It's great to just kind of get together and make all these dark humor jokes where it's like, okay, let's not let that get out of the circle, but it's very helpful to kind of lighten the load a bit. And institutional support, at my previous job, I was very fortunate to have great supervisors who I could talk with, just not, none of us really knew what was going on in the online thing. So that was the one drawback, perhaps. And then right now at American University, really fortunate to have Peril with excellent institutional support mechanisms built in to the lab, into the research lab, such as monthly mental health meetings where people can attend voluntarily and then just kind of talk with each other, led by a mental health professional and also a professional with a PhD in psychology. So yeah, very helpful. And then of course, as more reports come out, I think it'll help all of us as a whole just build a more robust, kind of more officialized like network of being prepared on the front end, especially on the institutional side, to be able to support researchers and also, take in consideration gender identity, race, one's race and ethnicity, religious background, for example, if you're Jewish and you're looking at a lot of anti-Semitic materials, for example. So it's great to see the deeper, it's like an onion peeling back deeper and deeper levels of issues pertaining to researcher safety, but also the positionality of the researcher themselves. Thank you.
And if you permit me a follow-up question, so you wrote this report for GNet, I think it was around Christmas time it came out, right? And it was focusing specifically on women of color in this field. Were there any particular kind of linkages you saw directly from people you were talking to and reading the report, or was there perhaps completely different and diverse findings?
Actually, I did see a lot of linkages, like especially discussions on personal identity and how that can impact, what different types of things will affect you. So if you're a woman and you're seeing a lot of misogynist content, it's much more personalized than if you're looking at if your identity is not being threatened by the narratives that you're being exposed to online. And I think maybe what was more pronounced from researchers of color, and again, huge thank you for these women of color who shared their experiences and were willing to talk about, these difficult things. I think it was what stood out was the institutional potential blowback that they could face, and then feeling that extra pressure from being a woman and also being a woman of color, like having to go through like another barrier that perhaps other researchers may not face in that regard. And then also, of course, like feelings of direct threats from these groups. So if you're a Black woman looking at neo-Nazis and knowing that like if they catch on to it, if you're not, if you are not having a really tight protocol, if any of these groups catch on to that, then you will be their go-to target. They will immediately come after you. They will seek you out, and it can be just a heightened sense of danger because of one's identity. And also, also researchers who are in the queer community. There's expanding research now about anti-LGBTQ narratives, and it's always been there, right? But it seems like the research focused on that is fortunately becoming more like published. So that also is, as it comes more to the forefront, it's also about gender identity and also very much the anti-trans narratives that are going around in like far right white supremacist spaces, and also of course Muslim researchers, right, that are looking at Islamophobic groups and Salafi jihadist content, where it can sometimes feel like a personal face off with these groups who have these very violent interpretations of Islam. And of course, as Muslims, right, it's not the norm, right? It's not the norm. So it feels like, yes, it's a personal pushback against the violent things that you see.
Thank you. That point on Muslim research is, I think, a really important one. Multiple of our participants said that they kind of faced this double issue, that if they researched jihadists, they were considered to be traitors from that perspective, but we're also facing Islamophobic threats from the far right as well, and it's essentially feeling like you're kind of being attacked from all corners. Fantastic. Well, I'll hand over to Jacob now if you're willing to get going. Thanks.
Of course. Thanks so much, Joe, and thank you for having me with you this afternoon as well. So over the last nearly 9 years, I've been working in this space, first at university and then at ISD, delivering online research. There have been a number of significant changes in the field. Of course, there's been a significant maturity and maturing of the methodologies which are employed. There's also been significant changes in the extremist landscape. When I started off, predominantly this work was focusing on IS, and now there's been great maturing in the digital work looking at the extreme right wing. That bringing with it, obviously, shifts in content, which people would be engaging with, and shifts in risk. And I think the area of sort of maturing, which I really want to dwell on, is actually the shifts which I've seen in addressing this exact issue area. Now, when I was very first starting out, there were very few, if any, that I'm aware of, formal conversations around researcher safeguarding, researcher risk, right? Most of it was swapping anecdotes, gaining advice from peers, you know, after a cup of coffee, a beer after a conference. We didn't see big structured programs of work like this or other working groups, which I'm aware is bringing up. And speaking to my peers as well, both at ISD and elsewhere, I think there has been a significant maturing of how, in some, but certainly not all, institutes, as your findings show, the sort of best practice which has been built around how to safeguard researchers. I've been very lucky to be involved in that process at ISD, as well as leading our work on online hate. I also our internal ethics officer. And so I've been able to start thinking through around internal changes. Of course, ISD's policy has evolved over the past 8 years, both within my institution and elsewhere. And I just wanted to sort of mull over and ruminate on those changes which we've introduced as we start to think through now what best practice will look like for researchers. And I think that there are two key areas which really jumped out to me when we're thinking about researcher safeguarding. And that's in changes in internal policy reflecting what's going on within an institute, specifically focusing on safeguarding, resilience and support for researchers, but then of course in preparedness for external threats as well. I think this most closely manifests now in terms of trolling, coordinated harassment campaigns. I'm acutely aware of the outweighed impact this has on my female colleagues and colleagues of colour as well. But it is something which I know impacts on all of us. I've been on the front end of several trolling campaigns over the year. And so that's the way I'm going to sort of divide my observations. I think internally, when we're thinking about what institutions can do for support, there's a bunch of very structured things, which I'll go into. But I think one of the bigger questions is actually this cultural shift. Now, broadly, I would say actually over the past decade, right, we've all gotten better about talking about our mental health. Taboos around that are being broken down. But I think bringing those broader dynamics in and having and maintaining and nurturing an internal culture which is cognizant of safeguarding issues, which is cognizant of researcher well-being, and creates a space where people feel comfortable in having those conversations is essential. This can then start to manifest and bleed through into more firmed up policies, but it also creates an environment where people who are managing other people, where junior researchers feel that they can have these discussions around this, that they're not existing in isolation. And I think that that is something which needs to be nurtured rather than taken for granted. I think that people can, and this is speaking as someone coming from the UK, keep a bit of a stiff upper lip about this. Okay, we don't want to talk about it, we want to brush it under the surface. But actually creating that culture then allows you to institute better structures around this. So next up is sort of like how we would institutionalize and operationalize that cultural change. And I think beyond creating environments where people can have those conversations, there's also a series of more practical steps, which I've certainly found really, really helpful. And I think that as others are thinking about instituting change, this might be useful. So part of that is actually trainings. So, okay, we can create a culture around having these discussions. People might still feel that they want some best practice for how to approach those conversations, particularly when we're talking about management. And I think that that sort of creation of formal training around how to handle issues of trauma is essential, particularly when we're thinking about structures where you have senior researchers or senior analysts managing smaller teams. This can then also be implemented into regular facilitated group discussions around conversation as to provide sort of a platform for conversation around these issue areas. There's also then much more practical pieces which can come in. I think having risk reviews at the outset, it sounds like this is something which takes place in some contexts, but not others, particularly in the academic field, are essential, right? We need to be aware around what we can do. And we also need to make sure that we're cascading that in, right? So that analysts have the opportunity to opt out of research, so that there is counselling provision on hand for people engaging in high risk work. Of course, that's not going to be the same across teams. A team analysing COVID-19 conspiracy theories will have a very different experience than a team analysing ISIS visual propaganda material. But having those formalised structures to build upon that culture, I have found is really helpful. And then, of course, working around safer working practices. And this is where I see that sort of internal bleed out into that external. So, of course, there's a lot of work which can be done around operational security as a researcher. Something which I've found helpful, and I know my teams have found helpful, is having pen tests online, having surveys of digital hygiene, trying to identify weaknesses in your own social media practice, making sure that ultimately you're not making it easier for the sorts of people you'll be researching to then come out and engage in coordinated and targeted trolling and harassment campaigns. I think then there's also work to be done on building out policies, and this is something which I've fed into institutionally, but again, speaking to colleagues in academia, it sounds like there's not always best practice to go to around what to actually do when someone is being targeted for harassment. And I believe that there is sometimes a culture of not wanting to talk out about this, but actually thinking through, okay, is there support you can have in place to check when a colleague's being attacked online, so that they don't have to do that research themselves, that assessment themselves. That can be hugely traumatic. If you just worked up to getting a report out, and then suddenly people are piling onto you from all corners of the internet, and you're there yourself going through your Twitter replies to try and assess the risk. Now that's clearly not as helpful as having a colleague who can support on that. I think also then there's broader conversations to be had around engagement with law enforcement on this. You know, should a researcher be being targeted online, as well as more practical steps like turning off your notifications and handing it over for external reviews. I think that this is always something which is going to mature. It's going to mature with the communities we're looking at and analysing as their tactics evolve. It's going to mature with the types of content we're looking in. Something no one has really talked about is what does best practice and safeguarding look like in potential VR environments yet. That's something I'm really interested in unpicking. So I think it's important to say that this best practice won't stay the same, because particularly digital research on extremist communities is a constantly shifting and evolving piece. But I think that if you can think about A, maintaining that culture, B, institution policies which build upon that sort of culture where discussing this sort of work is encouraged, and discussing the impacts of our work is encouraged, and then B, and then C, think about sort of how you can then prepare for high risk scenarios when people are coming in. That's personally what I found is quite helpful, and might also be helpful if you're at that process where you're just thinking through what can institutional policies look like to mitigate against these crucial harms. I just want to finish off by thanking you again for the report as well. I think it's a really important piece of work.
Brilliant, thank you, Jacob. Okay, so I think we've got about 15 or so minutes for questions. So yeah, please do use the Q&A function on Zoom, and if you've got any thoughts, or yeah, I guess even you can even do the dreaded more of a comment than a question this time. I'll allow it for the first time ever as a chair, but I will abuse my position as chair to ask the first question, because I'm a researcher at Swansea University, but I also, as with all academics, have an admin job as well, and mine happens to be I'm the co-chair of the departmental ethics board. So from an institutional perspective, I'd like to hear something that I and my team could do that would help this situation. And there's one caveat, which is there's no money. This is not a part of certainly British institutions that have any funding available to them. So I'll be really keen. Jacob certainly touched on some really good kind of practices that he's brought in at ISD, but I'm really interested to hear what someone sitting on a university ethics board can do to both help aid research, but also safeguard researchers. And anyone can go first.
Well, I guess, you know, we know what they can't do from this, just speaking from this report, and that is what they need to do is kind of listen and understand and involve the research. You know, I think what comes through in the report is that the ethics committee process can be quite a distant thing. And some people said to us, well, I make sure it isn't by going along to those sessions where my work is going to be discussed so that people can ask me questions. And if they've got any misconceptions about what my work is, I will put them right on that. So I think that kind of listening and engaging is really, really important. What we didn't really talk about much here is the kind of the model, which is very much based on medical research, you know, with human research participants, you know, doing giving people trials of things, and it's very far from the kinds of work that we're doing, and yet that's kind of the feet of ethical approval committees are often still stuck in that kind of medical research ground, and it's about moving away from that. That's what people who spoke to us fed back on. And I just want to say that it's really important as well that, you know, we've got Jacob here is from ISD and Meili is from Peril, and we're lucky, we're in places where we have hubs, right? We are people who know other people, we work with teams that are doing this kind of work, but some researchers, they're all on their own. So they don't have a team, they don't have a community within their institution, they don't have an ethics board that is used to seeing this kind of work proposed. So it's about, and this is partly what this report is for, is about improving the knowledge, that base knowledge of the people who sit on those committees, because it is just people, and they come from all sorts of disciplines. Just improving that base knowledge and making them aware so that they're not starting from scratch, and also retaining that institutional knowledge, because ethics, you said, Joe, you're a co-chair at the moment, I think, that personnel, that changes, that rotates, and institutions are not very good in our experience fed back of retaining that knowledge about past projects or when people move and people move on. So it's about kind of building, Jacob mentioned as well, building the knowledge, the culture, but retaining that institutional knowledge, I think, is really important as well. If I abused my already speaking more than everyone else to speak more down here, so I'll shut up now.
I would completely agree with that. I think it sounds like in certain areas there is just a complete lack, a limited amount of awareness around the fact that this sort of research can actually impact negatively on people's well-being. So it's around that. If I were to pivot away, and I suppose this is more advice for analysts than necessarily for the ethics board, but particularly thinking about people who are standing up and doing this work on their own without formalized support structures. I'm very lucky to work at an institute which is entirely focused very specifically on this issue area. I do think the digital hygiene part of this is helpful. Now, I think, of course, a lot of people are doing this, but there are also best practice guides out there. So just ensuring, if you're recognizing you're going to be a public figure around this, if you're going to be publishing work which might get attention of these sorts of extremist actors, doing that groundwork to just make sure basic things like your privacy settings are adjusted so it's less easy to dox you. Things like that are also really important best steps, and I think that is something in general people seem to be very cognizant of. I think in part because so many researchers in this field now are highly online, but actually just thinking through some of those basic steps are also, I think, really helpful when we're talking about preparing for the worst possible outcome of published work here.
Okay, some really good questions in here. So we do have Liz, who is a PhD supervisor, and Meili, who's a PhD student. So I'm going to go to Dario's question next, which is, I'm curious if you have any experiences / insights from the report around supervision at PhD level in this field, best practices or the other side, downfalls for both students and supervisors. Are you happy to go first, Meili?
Oh, okay. Yeah. I guess from the PhD student aspect, I would say that in terms of potential downfalls in this area of research, there's like the normal pressure, I think, that whether you're master's student, PhD, just grad school in general, that it can be a lot of pressure from like the class standpoint, the academic standpoint, just even outside of specific terrorism research. So in addition to just general, grad school pressures, I would say it's important to, in terms of coping mechanisms, to make sure you have time for other hobbies. And as the report had emphasized too, like the ability to talk to other people who might be looking at these at similar themes of like extremism, but not even only extremism, because the report also emphasized the really important aspect of the shared commonalities, even with like journalists who are covering certain types of violence. And it doesn't have to be like just within extremism, but talking to people who might look at similar, wider general content, it could be very helpful. And then from a personal standpoint, a subjective thing that worked for me, it might not work for everyone, but I found just making sure I have like my time to relax and just have nothing to do with these topics, it's been really helpful for me to even just alleviate grad school pressure as well. So it's been a nice balance from like a personal standpoint. But yeah, happy to elaborate more though if you would like, and hopefully I hope I answered the question okay on that.
So reflecting, Joe, I don't know if you're speaking, but you're muted then. But okay, great. So yeah, so just to reflect on that question from the report itself. Well, I mentioned this kind of the precarity of junior researchers impacting their vulnerability and amplifying the potential effects and risks and harms of the field. So that desire not to cause trouble, the desire to look good, the desire not to be seen as the weakest link. And we did have experiences related to us about what some practices that some junior researchers, PhD students felt very uncomfortable with. So people being told to look at things on personal phones, for instance, in teams, people who are more senior basically giving advice that people didn't think, more junior researchers didn't accept was good advice, and kind of finding it very difficult to push back on that. So it's that sense of kind of hierarchy and not being able to push back. But that supervisor relationship is clearly really, really important. People did reflect that they found their supervisor was the right person to speak to. That was obviously when they had a good relationship with the supervisor. But the supervisor didn't really emerge in the report as the only person that people are speaking to. There are also, as was mentioned, people outside of academia, people that you meet at conferences, people who become unofficial kind of mentors or sort of friends who can guide you at other institutions that you meet. It's a very wide-ranging kind of community of people that was giving help to those PhD students. And I would say also that they were passing, we talk about this in the report, I didn't talk about it in the presentation, in terms of training, where people were really sort of using their experiences to trickle down. So people who had just come out of a PhD or, had undergrads were using their experiences to make sure where they had teams of undergrads doing their undergrad dissertation or master's students, they were using their experiences to make sure that they provided that really good supervision to encourage that talking, either building on the experience that they hadn't had or using the good experience that they had had. So there aren't really any there's no sort of general rules apart from that precarity and vulnerability for junior researchers. But it's also true that some senior researchers had felt very vulnerable and also unsupported by colleagues, I would say, sometimes when they'd had, that also comes through in the report. So there's a variety of different experiences there.
Brilliant. So I reckon we've probably got time for one more question, which I'm going to ask in a second from Maura and Mustafa. But I just want to highlight to people that an anonymous attendee made a really salient comment. Can the rest of you see that, or is that just for admins? Anyway, fair enough. Yeah, so thank you to whoever anonymous left a comment about doing their ethnography in a refugee camp in Bangladesh, and just sort of related to a lot of the traumas that they realize, that they see, and really understand how the kind of stress and trauma of all of this is relevant. I wanted to thank whoever wrote that. Okay, so Maura asks, what are the basic protocols that a researcher can follow on their own, specifically outside of the institution? And perhaps the underlying kind of subtext of that is if they perhaps don't feel that their institution can support them, or it's going to be too slow or something like that. So what's a protocol that an individual can personally do?
Could come in, but I know that there's a lot in the report as well. I would say, without institutional support, like a lot of the best practice does come down to personal preferences. But I think actually understanding, first of all, recognizing the fact that this can have an impact, and recognizing in yourself when exposure to certain types of content will have an impact is really important. Alongside that, then I think it is exploring coping strategies. I think a lot of the informal coping strategies still relate to working in a small team. There'd be that sort of the use of a dark sense of humor, for better or for worse, or for talking about it and discussing it. For me personally, it's about figuring out the tempo of work in a day and not doing it at all points, certainly not before bed. In terms of broader safeguarding and protectiveness without any terms of institutional support, I think that there's quite a lot of good guides on good digital hygiene online, which we can circulate afterwards. But that's more about making yourself safe. So being aware that work might have an impact when published amongst certain communities of harmful actors, recognizing which social media platforms you have available, and recognizing the risks which can come with that, be that coordinated harassment, broader threats, doxing, and then doing good digital hygiene. So looking at what is available about yourself online, thinking through, am I confident and comfortable with that information being accessible to potentially to extremist actors, and do I understand the potential risks therein? And then making small changes to those sorts of things if you're not confident. But I don't want to monopolize the answer here, because I know that everyone else will have good points as well.
Yeah, I think just to add to all the excellent points that Jacob made, I want to point something out that actually I did not know was so easy to do. It is a little bit time consuming and kind of annoying, honestly, but if you do not have access, for example, or your institution does not have access, right? Or yeah, well, we're talking about non-institutions, but there are services that actually can like take your information offline. And of course they are, paid services, but let's say you can't do this. And this is actually what I did when I was kind of more of like, without the institutional support I have now, I would actually search myself up online, and then I would see, where are my, if my parents' names appeared in their phone numbers, or, previous addresses. And then I would actually individually email these, what are they called? They're kind of like just information services. I mean, they're like a ton of random companies that will just, act like phone books in a way, but just they're online. So I would actually find the ones where I was uncomfortable with the information that was listed there, either for family or myself. And then I would email them and just say, hi, I am blah, blah, blah. I am researching this topic. I believe that this type of information online could potentially be harmful to my personal safety and that of my family. I would like to request for this information to be taken down. And so a lot of these little online services actually did respond, and they would either point me how to like submit a form through their services to take that information offline, or they would actually say, okay, we'll take care of it right away. I mean, there were a couple that didn't respond, so it's not like it can be a like a completely solid thing, but it's just something that I was able to do without institutional support, just kind of on my own, that made me feel a little bit more comfortable. And so it was kind of surprising. I didn't expect them to even take the time to email, but I would say it actually is worth doing. And yeah, it's just kind of one of those maybe overlooked things that I haven't quite heard about before, but I did myself, and I'm like, wow, this actually makes me feel better. And then also just keep in mind, like, especially if you have a very specific name, and depending on your comfort level, again, as Jacob had said, your different levels of safety and risk assessment. If you don't want your personal social medias to be attached to you, you can actually put, it might be better for you to consider putting like a fake name, a nickname, just so you're Instagram, Facebook, all your personal things do not pop up if extremists try to look your name up. So, and then also asking other researcher friends, right, to see, hey, if you're researching Salafi jihadism, please let me know if I'm mentioned in these, chats, or, if you're looking at Proud Boy stuff, let me know if they're talking about me. So just kind of relying on that very personal support network that might also be helpful.
But just really quickly add that it's not a competition. Never feel forced to do anything. Like everyone said, it's about what you feel comfortable with. What works for one person won't work for another. And community really came out as important. If you don't have a community within your institution, find your community, find your people. They're out there on social media. Use this event as an opportunity to kind of network and meet people. You don't have to go to every conference. You can still meet people just on social media. And read the report. There's more in there. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks. Well, that takes us about perfectly to 7 o'clock. So Maura did actually put one more question, which I can probably answer, which will wrap it up quite nicely because it's about the future. Are you planning to launch a campaign or a training for universities that are in need of your expertise and the know-how you have? Whether it's literally a training session will be a matter of some debate, but I think the future of this project is very much about, again, trying to talk to people that are practicing in this area and trying to come out with at the very least guidance document for people in this area, so it can help them both navigate their own projects as well as things like the ethics process. But with that, thank you so much to the panel. Really, really appreciate all your insights today. And thank you to everyone that came to watch. Brilliant. And I'm sure I'll see you all soon. Take care, everyone.